And as we know, home is a safe place for everyone to access the usual support that they could receive. And that is why, through the work of our landmark domestic abuse bill, we are committed to protecting victims in a stronger way.
Let's head over to see Neil Coyle in Bermondsey. Neil Coyle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As things stand, the government is discriminating against people who have no recourse to public funds restrictions imposed on them and their British-born children they are denied access to support. Will the Home Secretary end this discrimination by amending the domestic abuse bill to ensure help is provided to everyone affected by domestic violence and scrap this fundamentally racist policy?
Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, I say to the honourable gentleman, first of all, the domestic abuse bill was discussed, and in fact, I think it's fair to say, Mr. Speaker, has been discussed extensively in this House, and I actually want to thank everybody that's made outstanding contributions, including many of the organisations that participated in advance of the bill coming to the House of Commons itself. We are offering support to migrants who suffer domestic abuse through our destitute domestic violence concessions scheme, but also I would like to emphasise to the honourable gentleman, and he will know this from his own work as a Member of Parliament and with local authorities and the support that is provided by local authorities too, that of course people, individuals can access both safe accommodation and get support through various means, and that is incredibly important, Mr. Speaker.
David Simmons.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask my right honourable friend, does she agree that children who are often the hidden victims of domestic violence, either as victims themselves or through witnessing it amongst parents and other members of the household, are going to gain additional protection from our landmark domestic abuse bill?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question, and this is an important issue in terms of children and the protection of children. Children are victims when it comes to domestic abuse, and it is a sad fact that children often witness some of the most abhorrent abuse of their parent or of others as well. And of course the bill does exactly that. And in fact, I'm really pleased, very proud that we have made sure that children are absolutely at the heart of this bill. It's right that we safeguard and it's right that we protect them.
Shadow Minister Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Between 2015 and 2019, despite domestic violence cases rising by 77%, charging fell by 18% and conviction by 20%. In 2018-19, there were almost 60,000 reports of rape to the police, but less than 1,800 were charged and less than 1,000 convicted. The number of cases of rape referred by the police for charging decisions fell by 32% in 2019. How does the Secretary of State account for her government's performance in the falling rates of charge and conviction in sexual and domestic violence?
Well, the Honourable Lady will know that extensive work has been undertaken across government, and not just recently, but in previous years as well. I'm absolutely committed, as is my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, to ensure that we take an end-to-end approach to this through our work, through the Royal Commission that we're establishing on the criminal justice system, and also to make sure that so much more work is undertaken within policing to make sure that charges are undertaken, making sure as well that the right kind of effective training is put in place with police forces and police officers. I've been very clear about that through all my work in policing, as has the Policing Minister. But ultimately, of course, charging itself and getting those cases to court has to be the priority, which is why the Home Office is working in the right approach, in the right way, with the criminal justice system and the Lord Chancellor.
Anderson.
Number 4, please, sir. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I would like to group question 4 and question 5. We are ending free movement and will introduce a new, firmer, fairer, skills-led global immigration system, with further details of it published today. Last month, our immigration bill passed through this House unamended, despite the best efforts of the Labour Party and the separatist benches.
Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the people of Ashfield, I fully support this government in introducing a points-based immigration system. For far too long, freedom of movement has encouraged the exploitation of migrant labour, which has driven down wages, increased pressure on public services and had a significant impact on housing in places like Ashfield. Could my right honourable friend please assure me that moving forward, this government will implement a firm but fair points-based system attracting high-skilled workers whilst also prioritising British jobs for British people?
Well, I agree with my honourable friend. The points-based system will support our wider economic strategy by encouraging investment in the domestic UK workforce, whilst ensuring businesses can still attract the brightest and the best from around the world to Ashfield. We want employers to focus on training and investing in our domestic workforce, driving productivity and improving opportunities for resident workers, with immigration policy being part of, not an alternative, to our strategy for the UK labour market.
Mark Cullen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The introduction of the points-based immigration system is a pledge that we gave the British people and one that we are now delivering on. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that now is the time also for employers to create the working conditions for our homegrown population to be attracted to the work that these employers should be offering as well? Thank you.
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. Under our new points-based immigration system, the UK, especially the Black Country, will continue to be open to the best talent from around the world. But it is right, employers should always be looking to recruit from the domestic workforce first and ensure they offer terms and conditions, plus career development opportunities, which make this possible, especially as we look to support those who have suffered the economic effects of COVID-19 back into work.
We now come to Rachel Hopkins with her substantive.
Number 6. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I'd like to group this question with nearly every other question on the order paper. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 and 12, please, sir. The government is now spending over £15,000 million on policing, an increase of £1 billion on last year, with £700 million being allocated to police and crime commissions to recruit 6,000 additional officers by the end of March 2021. While there's no direct connection between police numbers and crime, this will give them the capacity to be much more agile in the face of changing crime.
Rachel Hopkins.
Mr. Speaker, in Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Constabulary's recent annual assessment of policing, he stated that policing and some other public services are closely linked, and that the level of investment in one public service will have an effect, good or bad, on another, and referenced health, particularly mental health, drug and alcohol services, housing, social services as examples. So can the Minister confirm what assessment he has made of the huge detrimental impact that COVID-19 has made on local authorities responsible for these services, and the fact that many local councils, including Luton Council in my constituency, are being forced into making significant in-year budget cuts, and thus its impact on local policing?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is quite right to draw the connections between policing and other services in the public sector, but I can't speak to the resilience or otherwise of the finances of her particular local authority. What I can say is that the Prime Minister has tasked me and the Home Secretary with the job of driving cross-government working to deal with some of those causal factors to crime beyond enforcement, and we will be talking to local authorities across the country about the part they can play.
James.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Money for additional police officers is welcomed across the board, even though it doesn't take police numbers back to pre-2010 levels. But can I ask the Minister, surely he would acknowledge that baseline budgets in police forces have been cut again this year, and capital funding is almost non-existent. So surely, unless the Secretary of State is able to win more money for policing generally, forces will be unable to afford to keep the officers they've got.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman is obviously a cup half-empty person, rather than a cup nearly three-quarters full, and the biggest settlement for policing in a decade should be welcomed by everybody across this House, as it has been across the whole of the policing family. But that's not to say policing isn't without challenges and that it can't be more efficient. And while we do want to see more police officers and a better response to crime, there's always the challenge in public service to do things better for less.
Let's head up and see Rosie Cooper in lovely Lancashire. Rosie Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Lancashire has been allocated a funding of £4.3 million to deliver the additional 153 police officers by the end of this financial year. But that award reflects a part-year cost, as 153 officers can't be employed for the whole year, as that cost is £9.8 million. So will the Secretary of State commit to providing the funding in 21-22, the full funding, and for future years to sustain these additional officers?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady is perhaps confusing her figures, shall we say, Lancashire Police received £22.6 million increase in funding this year, which will allow them to recruit another 153 police officers over the next 12 months, less than 12 months now, up to March next year. They're making good progress and have recruited 66 already.
Let us head across the world. Margaret Greenwood.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, coastal communities like West Kirby and Caldy in my constituency have seen huge numbers of visitors in search of relaxation and exercise. This has placed additional strain on Merseyside Police, who've been working hard to respond to the concerns of local residents about crowds on beaches and in parks. Merseyside Police estimate that the cost of the pandemic to date is £4.1 million due to overtime, cost of PPE, specialist cleaning and lost income. So will the Minister give assurance that Merseyside Police will be reimbursed for these costs?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've had a number of telephone conversations with the Chief Constable of Merseyside Police over the last few weeks and months, as has my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, and I'm pleased to say that that force is in good heart, as far as we can tell. Happily, they are running well in advance of their recruitment allocation, and I'm told at the end of March they've recruited 220 police officers against an allocation of 200, which does give them extra capacity to deal with the problems that she has outlined. Notwithstanding that fact, there are obviously extra costs for policing in COVID-19, and we're in conversation with the Treasury about how we might address them.
Sir Geoffrey Clifton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the excellent announcement that my right honourable friend has given the House this afternoon, which goes a long way towards meeting our Conservative Party pledge to recruit an extra 20,000 police officers, would he agree that the real importance of those police officers is that every criminal will know that it's much more likely that their crime is going to be investigated, and if it's proved, will result in a prosecution?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, with his usual perspicacity, the honourable member puts his finger on their button. We know that the greatest deterrent of crime is the perception of the likelihood of being caught. And the fact that Gloucestershire Police have now more than recruited their annual allocation of police officers, he'll be pleased to hear 48 over 46 already so far this year, means that that is much more likely to be the case in his county.
Peter Aldous.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Suffolk Constabulary are one of the lowest funded forces from central government, have made significant efficiency savings and have increased council tax by over 25% in 3 years. Can my right honourable friend the Minister confirm that the review of the grant funding formula is still going ahead in the next few months, as this is vital to the future of policing in Suffolk?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman is a doughty champion for his constituency in his county, and I understand his impatience and his desire to battle for their financial interests, as I did as a backbencher for Hampshire as well. We have, both the Home Secretary and I, said in public in the past that the funding formula, while it's the only formula we've got at the moment, is a bit old-fashioned, probably needs a look at, and as part of our vision for policing in the future, no doubt we will get to it in time.
Ruth Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Minister join me in praising Nottinghamshire Police, who have acted so quickly to recruit more officers that they are 12 months ahead of the government's recruitment target and were the first force to introduce police officer degree apprenticeships? And does he agree with me that forces like Nottinghamshire, which are leading the way and which have also increased their diversity, should be first in line for any additional government funding?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's very heartening to see that as one of her priorities as a new member in this House is to stand with and defend her local police, and she's quite right to do so. And I join her in offering our thanks and praise to them for the work they've done. And in fact, I was able to do so in person because I was on the phone with her Chief Constable just this morning. She's quite right that Nottinghamshire is a forward-looking police force, and we will be supporting them in their endeavours to innovate and challenge crime in the months to come.
Shadow Minister Sarah Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the one hand, the Prime Minister has hailed an end to austerity and promised 20,000 new frontline police officers. On the other, we have alarming reports at the weekend of forces facing up to 15% cuts. COVID, on top of 10 years of austerity, has created a perfect storm for police funding. Lower council tax coming in, costs of PPE, lower income from some of their sources like airports and large events. And I have heard from multiple sources that essential staff jobs will have to be cut, meaning that frontline police officers will end up covering non-frontline roles, completely the opposite of what the Prime Minister intends. One senior police officer said to me this morning, this looks like austerity by the the back door. Can the Minister commit today to plugging the funding gap from council precepts to guarantee there won't be a need to cut police staff?
Well, Mr. Speaker, first of all, on a technical front, I think the Honourable Lady perhaps misunderstands how the precept worked, in that the primary liability, if you like, is covered by the precepting authority, which has, by law, to pass on the precept in full, notwithstanding any issues that it might have with collection. And perhaps, Mr. Speaker, alongside her many skills, she's acquired telepathy and foresight, because she seems to be preempting a spending review which hasn't even started.
Right, we now come to a substantive question from Mark Logan to the Home Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With permission, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to group this with question 15 and 16. We are, as we've already discussed, Mr. Speaker, in the process of recruiting an extra 20,000 police officers to put violent criminals behind bars, and already I can announce, Mr. Speaker, that already we have recruited over 3,000 of those officers, and we will continue to ensure that we back the police and ensure that we will deliver on higher police numbers.
We now wander up to see Mark Logan in Bolton. Mark Logan.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And speeding complaints are well and truly up in Bolton North East. All this fast is making my constituents furious. The day I took part in a community speed watch on Ainsworth Lane, 74 miles per hour was recorded in a 20-mile-an-hour zone. The problem is particularly severe on Blackburn, Halliwell and Turton roads. Many of these 20-mile-an-hour areas are located near schools, yet the speed limit is not enforced. Does the Secretary of State agree that regulations should be introduced to ensure speed limits are adhered to and close a very dangerous loophole to keep my residents safe and put an end to the fast and furious sequels?
Mr. Speaker, I actually agree with the Honourable Gentleman about the devastating impact that speeding can have on lives and on communities, and he is right to highlight the irresponsible speeds that are being driven, particularly in residential areas near schools. We do not plan to legislate, but of course he will know very specifically police enforcement around speeding is very much a matter for the police authority itself, and I'd be very happy to work with him if he has particular issues or concerns that he would like me to pick up.
Ben Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I bounced in here this afternoon ready to sing the praises of Thames Valley Police Force for their positive recruitment campaign ahead of schedule to meet their officers' targets. But it seems that this isn't new news, because all of the other members on these benches are similarly pleased with their local forces for meeting their police targets and getting those officers' numbers up. So perhaps, Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary will join me instead in praising especially the Thames Valley Police in Milton Keynes for keeping our rural communities and our city centre communities safe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I commend my honourable friend for his enthusiasm, his gusto, and actually his support for Thames Valley Police. I will just share with the House, I've got a very, very fond spot for Thames Valley Police. They're one of the first police forces that I visited when I became Home Secretary. And I visited them, Mr. Speaker, because of a devastating event that took place, and that was a death of a police officer, which was tragic. And I commend the Chief Constable, John Campbell, the officers. They are an impressive police force, they really are. They police a very significant geography, and quite frankly, they are the best of us all, and he's absolutely right to commend them for the work that they do.
Christian Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Getting more officers onto our streets is one of the people's priorities, and I know that is why my right honourable friend is committed to recruiting 20,000 over the next 3 years. But can my right honourable friend confirm how many have been recruited in Greater Manchester, and can she also ensure my constituents that they are fully equipped to tackle crime and keep our streets safe?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for his question and his dedication and support as well, both to policing locally, but to his constituents in terms of wanting to keep them safe. That is absolutely right. And I can confirm, in terms of recruitment locally across Greater Manchester, I do commend his Chief Constable as well. As of the end of March, Greater Manchester Police had recruited an additional 94 officers towards the year allocation. I can confirm that number is going up and up. And Mr. Speaker, you may also be interested to know that since our campaign started, we have had over 70,000 applicants to become police officers. That is something we should be proud of, because policing is an incredible profession.
Alan Kearns.
Number 17, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to group this question, Mr. Speaker, with number 18. The Home Office has been working every single day with the National Police Chief Council throughout the COVID crisis. And of course, we've been working with them to back the police when it comes to law enforcement, but equally importantly, ensuring that they are resourced throughout COVID to provide the support that is required for frontline police officers.
Mr. Speaker, during this COVID period, many coastal communities have found themselves under threat from mass gatherings. In my constituency, Ogmore by Sea is one example and Barry Island is another. Will my right honourable friend join me in sending the strongest message that such behaviour will not be tolerated? And will she further support the police and pay tribute to them for the strong action they're taking in ensuring that the coastal communities can be enjoyed by families and by tourists who want to visit and enjoy the fantastic resource we have?
My right honourable friend is absolutely right, and I have visited his constituency in the past. I know what a beautiful constituency it is, and I do want to commend the officers and the police chief for all the work that they have been doing. And he's right to want that area protected for local residents, for it to be enjoyed in a responsible way. And of course, there is no scope for antisocial behaviour at all. And we want to make sure, and we have been continuing to support the police to make sure that they've been equipped throughout this COVID crisis to police effectively and encourage the right and responsible kinds of behaviours.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will my right honourable friend join me in welcoming the investment made by the Devon and Cornwall Police and Crime Commissioner Alison Hernandez just last week to provide an additional £500,000 in emergency funding to 20 tourism hotspots in our 2 counties, including 2 in my North Devon constituency, to help prevent alcohol-related antisocial behaviour following the lifting of lockdown, and commit to looking at how such additional COVID-related costs can be supported by the government?
My friend is absolutely right, and I commend everybody locally for the fantastic work that they've been doing across policing, and of course our Police and Crime Commissioner and the Honourable Member as well. She's right to raise the additional costs of COVID. In fact, my Honourable friend, the Police Minister, has already touched on the fact that we are in discussions with the Treasury. It is inevitable that extra costs have arisen, whether it's through PPE or additional time and hours that police officers have been given. That is ongoing, but at this particular point, Mr. Speaker, I would like to commend everybody for the great work that they've been doing throughout this crisis.
Minister Connor again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I fully agree with the Home Secretary in supporting the work that the police do to maintain public order. But I can't help but feel, Mr. Speaker, the Home Secretary talks a good game, but we haven't seen much evidence of action, because we've seen a marked decline in the number of public order trained officers and police support units on this government's watch, and the recruitment that she talks about simply won't replace those and does take a lot of time. So can the Home Secretary tell us what she's doing now, today, to support Chief Constables in dealing with these pressures and to ensure our frontline officers have the proper resources and the training they need?
Well, it's absolutely right that through the recruitment and the investment that this government is putting into policing, the largest ever policing fund and settlement, certainly for the last decade, over £1 billion, it is... No, I have not sacked them all, to be quite frank. No. Mr. Speaker, our investment in policing is the largest investment in over a decade, and that is something that every single police chief around the country is supporting. And I think the Honourable Gentleman should take stock of the fact that when he speaks to police chiefs, as I do every single day, as my honourable friend the Police Minister does every single day, that they welcome the investment in new officers, but also the training. The fact of the matter is the money that has been put into invest in new officers also covers the training, a wide range of training. That's training that has gone into the National College of Policing. That's training and investment in the professional development. It's taking place now in the professional development of our police officers. That is something we should all be proud of.
Right. 20 not here, so I'm going straight on to Rishi Raleigh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Question number 21.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I would like to group this question with questions 22 and 23. Home Office and Department of Health and Social Care officials are working to implement the surcharge exemption. The Home Office is currently identifying all those on a Tier 2 visa who will benefit from a refund, and these payments have already started. Those eligible to apply for the new health and care visa will be exempt from the immigration health surcharge.
I thank the Minister for his answer, but the fact that migrant workers in the NHS and care sector have had to pay the surcharge in the first place is an insult to their sacrifices. And the fact that the government is taking so long to implement the promise that the Prime Minister made is an added insult. Can I ask the Minister how many people have actually now got the exemption and how many are left to receive it?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, when the honourable member refers to how long, in my answer I already said refund payments have already started, and we are imminent to implement the new health and care visa, which will see those under it exempt. So work is continuing, and to be clear, the health surcharge is about creating resources for the NHS and has supported the NHS, but we've announced this policy and we're driving it forward.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Mr. Speaker will know, the Ilford South is a very diverse constituency. 60% of my local population come from either the heritage or directly, from immigrant communities. The Oxford University done a study just last year that said 25 billion between 2001 and 2011 was a net fiscal giving to our country's economy. So one thing that people in Ilford South are wondering is whether or not the Minister agrees that the policy that the government had acted so slowly to move forward was not only wrong, but that the government should offer an apology to people in Ilford South working in our NHS who are fearful, risking their lives and not getting the support they deserve from the government.
Well, I think the people of Ilford South working with the NHS will have been pleased to see the measures that we've taken, and not least the fact that we will look to prioritise those coming to work for the NHS under our new visa system.
Sarah Sultan.
Mr. Speaker, key workers kept our country running through the crisis, from doctors and nurses to supermarket assistants and delivery drivers. That's why we clap for them, and they all pay their taxes, they all contribute to the NHS. That's why the NHS surcharge is a discriminatory double tax on migrants. So since the government acknowledges that it's wrong to clap for nurses one day and charge them extra the next, will the Minister extend this principle to all workers and scrap the immigration health surcharge for all?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd probably contrast some of those comments with the comments we got on the immigration health surcharge from the Labour Party during the Bill Committee. But in terms of where this is, we're clear that our NHS offers fantastic, free at point of need care and services, and it's not unreasonable to ask those who come to this country to make a contribution towards it until they achieve ILR in settlement, which means that reflecting a long-term commitment to this country, which then means they're exempt from it.
Shadow Minister Holly Lynch.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Further to the excellent questions already asked, Dr. Sadara is just one of the hundreds of clinicians who's already had to pay the immigration health surcharge since the Prime Minister said it would end, not just for himself and his wife, but twice in 6 months for his newborn baby daughter. We don't just want these medics to stay in the NHS, we need them to stay in the NHS. The new rules published this morning confirm that the charge will end, but they don't come into effect until January. So can the Minister update the House? When will the surcharge end for health and social care workers? And why does the detail published this morning suggest that some will still have to pay it, only to be reimbursed?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. First, in starting, the details published this morning relate to the new system beyond the 1st of January. However, to be clear, we will refund those who've paid it since the 31st of March, not just since the time when the Prime Minister made the announcement. And we expect to bring in the new health and care visa significantly before the 1st of January, and hopefully we're planning actually before the 1st of October to have it in place. And that means people will therefore, applying for that, will not have to pay the surcharge.
Number 25, sir.
We are committed to protecting places of worship from hate crime through the Places of Worship Protective Security Scheme. The funding for next year is an uplift of nearly double to £3.2 million, double the amount awarded last year. Our public consultation on providing greater protection from hate crime for places of worship closed on the 28th of June, and we're reviewing responses and will respond in due course.
John Howell.
There is a balance to be struck between worshipping openly and being provided with adequate security. Would the Minister say what success the government's Places of Worship Protective Security Funding Scheme has had in achieving that balance?
Minister Atkins.
Very much so. I can assure my honourable friend that the Places of Worship Protective Security Scheme has been designed so that each place of worship can apply for practical security measures that suit their individual needs, ranging from CCTV to alarm systems. This allows each place of worship to remain open and accessible for worshippers while providing greater security. We want to ensure that this scheme listens to worshippers and their communities when seeking to achieve the balance to which he rightly refers.
Champion.
Mr. Speaker, question 26.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the Honourable Lady for her question, and in particular, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to pay tribute to the Honourable Lady for the work that she has done specifically on the whole issue of child sexual exploitation.
Yes. Sir Champion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful that the Home Secretary takes this topic seriously. We in Rotherham are very fortunate because we have the National Crime Agency to deal with past cases, but will she also look at cases across the country, the resources that the police forces have there, but also the local authorities who have to step in and put the child protection in place and the victim support in place? There isn't enough nationally.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Honourable Lady is right, and in fact it's fair to say she and I go back a long way on this issue. I recall when she first came to see me in the Treasury many years ago to raise this point. And she knows as well that I've recently announced the Home Office will be publishing a paper to help us better understand characteristics associated with groups. And I would welcome and ask the Honourable Lady to work with me and join our external reference group that I have established on this important area. But, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady specifically raises issues around third-party organisations. She mentions in her own constituency, and I've met many of those survivors and sufferers directly with her on this issue. They've had a terrible time. They've also been failed by many aspects of the state and society. We can never allow that to happen again, which is why I'm committed, not just from resourcing, but also through the work that I've commissioned in the department, which I know she will join me in and support us on our work on that, but making sure that no other aspect of the state or organisation or third party or government institution turns a blind eye and ignores the needs of individuals in the way in which happened in her own constituency.
Number 27, please, Mr. Speaker.
We are firmly committed to making the UK the safest place in the world to be online. We will be publishing a full government response to the online harms white paper consultation in the autumn, and our ambition is to bring forward legislation in this session. In the meantime, the Home Office continues to engage with social media platforms on the safety of their users. We are clear that these companies need to take action now to tackle illegal harms.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's been over a year since the government published its online harms white paper, and yet there is still no proper protection in place. Instead, all we've had are delays, ministerial briefings about potentially watering down the sanctions within the white paper, and continued intensive lobbying by tech giants, who, by the way, Mr. Speaker, are still failing to remove harmful content and disinformation. That really is poor. So can the Minister update the House about what conversations she has had with social media companies about taking down harmful content, and when exactly will the online harms bill finally be published?
Minister Atkins.
Well, actually, the online harms white paper was world-leading in its ambitions in terms of sorting out the online world. We're very clear what's illegal offline is also illegal online, and that has been the driving force behind our work on this white paper and on the consultation. As I say, we'll be responding to the consultation in the autumn. We are very much working at pace on this, but we should not shirk the fact that we are leading the world potentially with this work, including our work on tackling child sexual exploitation online, and we all want this abuse to stop.
Patrick Reddy.
Question 28, Mr. Speaker.
With your permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to group question 28 with question 29. We remain committed to providing support and accommodation to those who need it, but in addition to that free accommodation, we also pay for utility bills, council tax, free NHS care is available to those who need it, and there is free education for those with children. In addition to that, for 3 months, starting on the 27th of March, we paused the process of asylum cessation, and in addition to that, there was a 5% increase in the cash allowance made just a few weeks ago.
Patrick Reddy.
I'm not suggesting he wouldn't give these things to people who need them, no matter what their background or where they come from. Now, he was good enough to meet with Glasgow's MPs, but the reality is that forcing over 300 vulnerable asylum seekers into hotels by the contractor mayors has really significantly damaged trust in the system. And to rebuild that trust, there has to be an independent review and lessons learned. So can he tell us what steps is he taking to make sure that review happens?
Well, he's right. 341 people were moved at the end of March from temporary service departments into hotel accommodation because the temporary service departments were considered unsuitable, bearing in mind coronavirus. He's also right that I have been meeting with Glasgow MPs and will, of course, continue to do so. I've met twice with Eileen Campbell, the Cabinet Secretary, and with the leader of Glasgow City Council, and I've committed to continue such meetings going forward, and he and I have spoken about that. There are some specific concerns which he and his colleagues have raised concerning the hotel accommodation, and I've asked officials in the Home Office to urgently look into those and to report back to me.
Heading to Motherwell to visit Marion Fellows. Marion Fellows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The requirements in the asylum accommodation contracts to safeguard vulnerable people are absolutely vital. Yet, the recent National Audit Office report discloses that the contract fails to provide for proper monitoring of them or sanctions for breaches. Will the Minister fix that? And will he explain why there is no safeguarding framework in place yet, despite this contract being worth billions of pounds of public money?
Well, we are, of course, studying the report very carefully. We do, as you would expect, Mr. Speaker, monitor very carefully the way that the contractors operate, and where concerns are raised, as, for example, they have been in relation to Glasgow by Glasgow MPs and others, we do look into those and investigate them very seriously, and that is what we're doing in the case of Glasgow.
SNP spokesperson Joanna Cherry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The National Audit Office report, which my honourable friend, the member for Motherwell and Wishaw mentioned, is not just about value for money, but it's also about people. And of course, asylum seekers are by their very nature vulnerable people. Many of them are survivors of trafficking or ill treatment, including torture. Yet, under the existing Home Office contracts with private companies, it's possible for these private companies to shove hundreds of these asylum seekers into hotels without doing proper individual assessments of their vulnerabilities. Now, the National Audit Office report records that 10 months into these contracts, there is no safeguarding framework. So what I'd like to hear from the Minister today is, can he give us a date on which he will introduce a safeguarding framework for these private company contracts?
Well, the Honourable Lady asked about vulnerability assessments, and in fact, in the case of Glasgow that we've been discussing, there were vulnerability assessments done before people were moved, and I understand that 109 people who might have been moved from the temporary serviced accommodation into the hotels were in fact not moved as a consequence of exactly that vulnerability assessment. And the Honourable Lady made a more general point about taking care of people who are vulnerable. This country has an extraordinarily proud record. Last year, we made 20,000 grants of asylum or protection, one of the highest in Europe. We welcomed over 3,500 unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, the highest of any European country, and we are the only G7 country to spend 0.7% of GNI. This government in this country has an extremely proud record in this area.
Cherry.
Well,
I thank the Minister for his answer, but I'm sure he will recall that there was a degree of uncertainty about the nature of the assessments that were carried out in Glasgow, and I'm sure he'll agree with me that having a safeguarding framework would ensure that that sort of oversight wouldn't happen again. But he mentioned meeting with the leader of Glasgow City Council. Now, he'll be aware that many local authorities are concerned that while the Home Office is happy to pay billions to private companies under these asylum contracts, there's been no assessment of the additional demands this places on local authority resources. And local authorities are concerned that the proper financial support they need is as far away as ever. So how does he expect more local authorities to become asylum dispersal areas if the government won't give existing local authorities the support that they require?
The central government, national government, provides a huge amount of support and finance to help these asylum-seeking populations. We pay for all of the accommodation. We pay for the council tax, which of course goes to local authorities. We pay for utility bills. Those who need healthcare are treated by the NHS, and of course funding flows from central government to do that. And those requiring education are educated, and again there's a per capita funding formula to cover that. So I mean, as far as I can see, national government is spending a huge amount of money supporting these populations. The figures, as the Honourable Lady says, run over multiple years into billions of pounds. I am always happy to talk to local authorities about the work they do and how we can work better together. That is what I'm doing already with Glasgow City Council, and via the Cabinet Secretary Eileen Campbell I hope to expand those conversations to cover other towns and cities in Scotland as well.
We're now starting with Topicals with Rob Butler.
Speaker, topical number 1, please.
4 years ago, Mr. Speaker, the British public voted to leave the EU. They voted to take back control of our borders and to end free movement. And last year, the British people voted to get Brexit done and introduce a points-based immigration system. Mr. Speaker, we are doing exactly that. But despite the best efforts of the party opposite, we are ending free movement and we are introducing a points-based system. And today we have published more details of that system, which will enable us to attract the brightest and the best. A firmer and fairer system that will take back control of our borders, crack down on foreign criminals and unleash our country's true potential, building a brighter future for Britain and signalling to the world that we are open for business.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week was the 15th anniversary of the 7/7 terrorist attacks. It was a moment once more to commemorate those who lost their lives and to repeat our appreciation for those who rushed to help those caught in those dreadful blasts, particularly from the emergency services. So could my right honourable friend update the House, please, on what plans her government has to try to prevent future such attacks, and particularly to monitor people who've raised the suspicions of the police and security services?
No, my honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely right to pay tribute and commemorate the anniversary of those attacks. In short, Mr. Speaker, we are constantly investing in our security and intelligence services, but also investing in counter-terrorism policing in particular. They've had an increase this year of £90 million, one of the largest uplifts ever, taking CT policing funding to over £900 million. And of course, we have to do more in terms of strengthening them, but making sure our system is fit and agile and responsive to all sorts of threats that come forward.
Shadow Home Secretary Nick Thomas-Simmons.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I, of course, join the Home Secretary in paying tribute to those who died in the 7/7 attacks and commend the work of the emergency services that day. Mr. Speaker, today, having read the details of the proposed new immigration system, I was disappointed, if unfortunately not shocked, to see evidence yet again that this government does not consider carers to be skilled workers, as they have been excluded from the qualifying list for the health and care visa. After the Prime Minister accused care workers of not following the guidance on COVID-19, and now this, can the Home Secretary please answer a simple question? What does the government have against care workers?
Minister Foster.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have every support for our care workers, and senior care workers will qualify under the new points-based system. And what I'd say to the honourable member is that people will look at what's happened over the last few months and think that surely the vision for the social care sector is not to carry on looking abroad to recruit at or near the minimum wage when we need to prioritise jobs here in this country.
Thomas Simmons.
Well, Mr. Speaker, we all want more people training and entering the care sector at a decent wage. Of course we do. But the reality is there are over 100,000 vacancies in England alone today. Now, some of us in the House, Mr. Speaker, don't need reminding of how important and skilled jobs of care workers are. But that doesn't always seem to be the case for members opposite. So I'd like to extend an invitation to the Home Secretary. I will convene a meeting of a delegation of care workers to help provide a better understanding of the incredible jobs they do alongside their trade union representatives. Would the Home Secretary care to join me? I'm sure the Right Honourable Lady would find meeting frontline care workers incredibly useful when sitting there deciding how skilled people's jobs are.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think many people in Torfaen and Halifax listening to the honourable gentleman will wonder whether he's been following the news recently about, sadly, the impacts economically of COVID-19 and the number of our own UK-based workers who will need to get back into employment. So it's hard to believe that many will then believe there's a labour shortage. But we are engaging regularly with the care sector. We're listening to what they say, but our priority is that in future these jobs be valued, rewarded and trained for, not immigration be an alternative to that.
Let's head to Ludlow and visit Philip Dunn. Philip Dunn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Environmental Audit Committee highlighted in our reports on hand car washes in 2018 and fast fashion in 2019 clear evidence of modern slavery in plain sight in hand car washes on streets across Britain and in garment factories in Leicester. Will my right honourable friend commit to do all she can to work across government agencies to rid this scourge from our towns and cities?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I completely agree with my right honourable friend in terms of what he has described as a modern-day scourge when it comes to exploitation. He mentions car hand washes. Mr. Speaker, I think local authorities themselves need to do so much more in terms of stepping in and going in to investigate with trading standards. But he is right to press me and press the government on integrated working across all aspects of the state at a national government level and also at a local authority level as well. But he also mentions Leicester. He, like all honourable members of this House, will be interested to know that we have established a cross-government task force that will be on the ground in Leicester to absolutely ask the difficult questions of all institutions and organisations across Leicester with regards to this scourge that is taking place in the textile sector.
So the Select Committee, Ben Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Select Committee has repeatedly called on the government to include care workers alongside NHS medical staff in the free visa extension for COVID-19 this year. And by refusing to do so, ministers have cost those frontline workers thousands of pounds this year. Can I ask the Home Secretary now whether her decision to exclude social care workers from the health and care visa does mean that those care workers will also have to pay the immigration surcharge up front? And if so, why is it fair for them to have to find many more thousands of pounds up front as well?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To be clear, the health and care visa, by the definition of its name, will include various areas in the care sector. But again, as I touched on to the Shadow Home Secretary, our vision for the future of the care sector is about providing rewarding opportunities to UK-based workers, not being based purely on immigration.
Fletcher.
My right honourable friend will fondly remember her visit to Clown in my constituency during the campaign and the popularity on the doorsteps for getting more police on the streets in Derbyshire. Our police are fantastic, but they need some new colleagues. Could she give us an update on that, please?
My friend is absolutely right, and if I may say so, I think in addition to more police officers in the Honourable Gentleman's constituency, he is equally as popular for his championing of more cops and also the excellent work that he is doing. I can confirm that across his county, Derbyshire will receive 85 officers as part of the uplift, but they've already recruited 60 new officers that will be coming to his community very, very soon.
Let's head to Manchester and visit Afzal Khan. Afzal Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. According to a new report from Coram Children's Legal Centre, there are more than 900,000 eligible EEA children thought to be living in the UK, of which Less than half have been granted status under the settlement scheme. Of the estimated 9,000 EEA children in the UK care system, the state, with a duty of care to these vulnerable children, has secured status for fewer than 500. What urgent action will the Home Secretary take on the back of these revelations to ensure that no vulnerable children are allowed to become undocumented?
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've already taken a range of action. We're working with local authorities who, as the Honourable Member touches on, has the duty to make the application for those eligible under the EUSS. We've also confirmed that we would accept late applications from those who should have had an application made on behalf of them on their behalf by their local council, and we're working with support groups as well, one of which I'm visiting tomorrow virtually.
Mr. Speaker, no one should be fearful of practising their faith anywhere, but there have been too many attacks both at home and abroad on all sorts of places of worship. So can I thank the Minister for the earlier answer to my friend, my honourable friend from Henley, in doubling the Places of Worship Protective Security Fund to £3.2 million, but also for the Home Office's recent consultation, which has recently closed. Does she believe that these measures put together will limit the chances of future hate crime attacks in the UK?
Absolutely right. This is valuable investment. It is appalling what we've seen in terms of the targeted attacks to places of worship. It's thoroughly unacceptable. It's that combined approach, along with law enforcement, that absolutely matters, because we want to see crimes of this nature absolutely decrease, and we want to stamp this out.
Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's over 3 months since Wendy Williams' Windrush Lessons Learned review was published. On the 23rd of June, I asked the Home Secretary when she would implement the review's 6th recommendation to accurately teach British colonial history in the Home Office to tackle institutional racism. The Windrush generation has waited too long for justice, and the government mustn't continue to drag its feet. The Home Secretary said that she would be bringing a timeline and an action plan for implementing the recommendations before recess appeared. Is that still the case?
Yes.
Right, Ben Everett.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, violent crime is the scourge of too many communities, and perhaps the Home Secretary would join me in paying tribute to the Police and Crime Commissioner from Thames Valley Police, who has put together a violence reduction unit working with the police and other partners to pilot early interventions into these offenders.
My friend is absolutely right, and I will pay tribute to the Police and Crime Commissioner for Thames Valley and the emphasis that he has given, along with the police force, on violence reduction units, but actually that multi-agency way of working, so that young people and people across all communities can be supported to ensure that crime prevention is absolutely the focus, and also steering people away from crime and criminality.
Let's head to Scotland and visit Martin Day. Martin Day.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When and why did the government U-turn on its commitment to a remote areas visa pilot, and who did it consult before making that disastrous U-turn?
Minister.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been very clear in our response to the Migration Advisory Committee report, and we'll make sure our new system is one that serves the whole of our United Kingdom.
Simon Feld.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Women's Community Matters in my constituency is an amazing place that helps women and families, including those in urgent need. But they're rightly concerned about the availability of refuges locally. There's one in Kendal. If it's full, families have to go out of the area and often placements fail. We've passed a landmark piece of legislation with the Domestic Abuse Bill. Will you look again at funding and availability of these services in rural areas like mine?
And for his question, he's absolutely right, and I commend him for his work locally and for raising this very point. If I may, Mr. Speaker, I will write to him with the specifics of what we can do in his local area to provide assistance and financial help.
Alex Cunningham.
Mr. Speaker, Cleveland has the 3rd highest violent crime rate in the country and ranks 6th highest nationally for offences involving knives and sharp instruments. The most serious violence offences are also increasing at a higher rate than the national average, and that's despite the excellent work by our new Chief Constable. The government's granted £100 million to 18 police force areas and PCCs deemed to have a significant problem with serious violence. Why hasn't Cleveland been included?
Well, Mr. Speaker, if I may, I will also join him in commending the work of his Chief Constable. Cleveland, he will know, has had a difficult few years when it comes not just to policing, and he will know the outcomes of many of the inspectorate reports as well. But when it comes to the areas of violence that he speaks about, of course, we're constantly looking at this whole area. And if there's more that we can do in terms of tackling serious violent crime, we will absolutely do that.
Andy Carter.
Speaker, my right honourable friend will know that the Peace Foundation is globally renowned for their work in supporting victims of terror incidents, most recently those affected in the Reading attacks. Their work is now at risk because of changes to their funding. Will the Home Secretary come to Warrington and meet the team there so that she can understand more about the great work that they're doing?
Speaker, first of all, let me commend my honourable friend for championing the work of the Peace Foundation. He's been in extensive dialogue with us on this, but he's right to point to the work that they do when it comes to victims of terror. And I'll be very happy to meet with him, come to Warrington and have further discussions about this.
Jim Shannon? Not here, never known. Jonathan Gillis.
Speaker, shockingly in Kidsgrove and Talk, local police officers are unable to access the outdated CCTV due to it being stationed in a local high street store. I was pleased when residents supported my plan to have the Labour-run Kidsgrove Town Council use their extensive funds for a CCTV upgrade. Will my right honourable friend back my plan, call for an end to the dither and delay, and demand Kidsgrove Town Council back our brave Staffordshire police officers?
It's absolutely right. We must end the dither and delay, as he has outlined. And I commend him for championing the CCTV to make sure that the local council does step up and do the right thing. I'll give him every backing that he needs.
Alex Davis-Jones.
Mr. Speaker, it is clear that child victims of domestic abuse who do not enter a refuge often require extra support, which is regularly being overlooked. Can the Home Secretary please confirm what specific resources are available to those children to ensure that their needs are met?
Yes.
Secretary.
If the Honourable Lady has specifics she would like to raise with me to come back to her on actual details for children. Obviously, we passed a domestic abuse bill last week in this House, and we've been very clear about the protections around children. That is absolutely right. There are many other measures that we have in place, and I'd be very happy to write to her about that.
Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our commitment to providing sanctuary to those fleeing war, famine and disease is important to many across the UK, and especially in my constituency of Newport West. At the end of the transition period, the UK will leave the Dublin system, risking the loss of an important safe route to reunification for families. So will the Home Secretary amend the refugee family reunion rules to allow more families to safely reunite here in Britain?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We set out clearly during the passage of the immigration bill recently our plan to look at negotiating a proper agreement with the European Union for family reunification based on the fantastic record we have and that my honourable friend outlined earlier.
Mr.
Speaker, residents in Paston, Warrington and other parts of Peterborough have had to endure unauthorised encampments on public land and open spaces for many years. They've left behind rubbish, industrial waste and even human waste, costing many thousands of pounds to clear up. Will my right honourable friend agree that this is unacceptable, and will she bring forward legislation to deal with this as soon as possible?
I think my honourable friend knows my views on this subject matter quite well, having campaigned with him. I absolutely agree with him. It is thoroughly unacceptable, and he will have to wait to the autumn session of Parliament, but we will be bringing forward legislation covering this very issue.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Order. Urgent question. Emily Thornbury.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. To ask the Secretary of State for International Trade to make a decision on her decision to resume the sale of arms to the Saudi-led coalition for use in the war in Yemen.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has retaken the licensing decisions as required by the Court of Appeal. All existing and new applications for Saudi Arabia for possible use in the conflict in Yemen will be assessed against the revised methodology, which considers whether there is a clear risk that the equipment might be used in the commission of a serious violation of international humanitarian law. The revised methodology was developed to address the Court of Appeal's judgment. It considers all allegations which are assessed as likely to have occurred and have been caused by fixed-wing aircraft, reflecting the factual circumstances that the court proceedings concerned. It remains the case, however, that it can be extremely difficult to reach firm conclusions as to whether specific incidents violate the principles of international humanitarian law. Therefore, where an incident is assessed as being a possible breach, they are regarded, for the purposes of the relevant analysis, as if they were breaches of IHL. I want to emphasise again that this analysis is just one part of the assessment. In retaking these decisions, the Secretary of State has considered the full range of information available to the government. Some of this information is necessarily sensitive and confidential. I am therefore not able to go into detail about individual assessments. The crucial point is that we have assessed that there were a small number of incidents which have been treated for the purposes of this analysis as violations of international humanitarian law. However, these were isolated incidents, and our analysis shows that Saudi Arabia does have a genuine intent and the capacity to comply with international humanitarian law and the specific commitments it has made. It is on that basis that the Secretary of State has assessed that there is not a clear risk that the export of arms and military equipment to Saudi Arabia might be used in the commission of a serious violation of international humanitarian law.
Emily Thornbury.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for granting this urgent question, although I'm sorry that the Secretary of State can't be dragged here to explain her own decisions. There is certainly much explaining to do, and in my limited time I have 5 questions for the Minister and 1 specific request. First, we welcome the Secretary of State's assessment of possible violations of international law in Yemen. But can the Minister explain why his brother ministers have been telling the House for years, for the last 5 years, that such an assessment was impossible for Britain to make and that could only be made by Saudi Arabia itself? So were those ministers simply wrong? Second, the Secretary of State has concluded that where international law was broken in Yemen, these were, I quote, isolated incidents. Can the Minister tell us how many such incidents were identified so that we can understand how they define the word isolated? Third, the government says it has found no patterns of civilian infrastructure being targeted. Could the Minister therefore explain why for 17 months at the start of the war, Saudi planes systematically destroyed Yemen's means of food production, bombing farmland, markets, milk plants and fishing boats? If that isn't a pattern, what is? Fourth, as well as deliberate targeting, the Minister will know that the indiscriminate bombing of civilian areas is in itself a war crime. But the government says the Saudis could not have meant to break international law because their violations occurred, and I quote, at different times, in different circumstances and for different reasons. Does the Minister not agree that this sounds like the very definition of the word indiscriminate? Fifth, the government has concluded that Saudi Arabia has both the intent and the capacity to comply with international law. But if that is the case, can the Minister explain the cause of the occasions they have failed to do so? And finally, Mr. Speaker, it would help all of us to understand the government's decision if they would agree to publish the full assessment that underpinned it, including the analysis of each so-called isolated incident. If the Minister believes this decision is not just moral and lawful, but correct, then surely he has nothing to fear from publishing that assessment and letting us all decide for ourselves.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank her for her questions. And can I start off by saying that we absolutely share her concern about the humanitarian tragedy in Yemen, and that is why the UK is engaged actively in seeking further diplomatic solutions. Let me try and deal with her questions as far as I am able. Of course, some of these matters are within the competence of the FCDO and the Ministry of Defence. Ministers, of course, have not been wrong in their assessment. If they had been wrong, then they would have come to the dispatch box. The consolidated criteria are what have been used in all of the assessments of these licences. In terms of the number of incidents, that is a question, an operational question. But I think in terms of the role of the Department for International Trade is in assessing the consolidated criteria. She talks about a number of incidents over different times and in different ways. The assessment was that there's no pattern here in the behaviour of Saudi, and that is that these were isolated incidents over some considerable time and also at different times within that. She mentioned the intention and capacity to comply and to publish the full assessment of the various incidents. It's worth saying, Mr. Speaker, which you will certainly understand, that the full, and she asked for a full analysis of each incident. Clearly, those different incidents that took place in Yemen will be informed, often by confidential information that comes to the government, not necessarily from Saudi Arabia. It would not be appropriate for us to publish those assessments. What we have published, however, is the consolidated criteria and also the quarterly lists of each licence that has been granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister knows that I am a long-standing critic of the policies towards Yemen of the Saudi coalition, which the British government continues to support. But it is not my purpose today to call for an arms embargo, but rather to ensure that in granting these contentious licences, UK arms export licensing regime members continue to have benefit from DFID's expertise once that department is dismantled. DFID officials sit on the Export Licensing Committee, and I would like his reassurance to the House that that DFID DNA, which is very important to making these decisions in the Licensing Committee, will still be available.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and certainly I would pay tribute to his long time as Secretary of State for International Development and the exceptionally good work that he did over a considerable time, both when we were in opposition and in government, and particularly the voice that he has had, the strong voice that he has had in relation to the conflict. I think in terms of the different parts of his question, I think in relation to the Committee on Arms Export Controls, that's really properly a matter for the committee under the chairmanship of my honourable friend, the member for Wyre Forest. However, he has said that the International Development Committee will continue to take part in its public sessions for as long as that committee continues in existence. And I think his other point, in terms of DFID officials, the government is obviously very keen that DFID and international development expertise in the region continues to be recognised and utilised.
We're heading up to Dundee West to visit the SNP spokesperson, Chris Law. Chris Law.
Mr. Speaker, this UK government is increasingly chaotic and incoherent. Last week, the Foreign Secretary announced a new sanctions regime, claiming the UK will be a stronger force for good, whilst International Trade Secretary resumes arms sales to Saudi Arabia, demonstrating that profit comes before peace. The international community, our allies and the UN have made clear that the arms trade to Saudi Arabia should be stopped due to the mounting evidence of what UN experts have described as potential war crimes and widespread and systematic strikes on civilian targets. Right now, Yemen has also been described as hanging by a thread, with over 1 million COVID infections. With the UN ascribing tens of thousands of civilian deaths to the Saudi military, how can the Secretary of State tell the UK with any certainty that there is not a clear risk of serious violations in exporting arms, describing previous violations as merely isolated incidents? Can the Minister tell us how many isolated incidents there are, who collated this evidence, and will he explain why the UK is going against the international community? Lastly, Mr. Speaker, surely these actions remove any legitimacy that this UK government can be a stronger force for good in the world.
Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, first of all, I strongly refute the allegation that the UK government is not a strong voice for good in the world. That is absolutely our mission right the way across the government. I think in terms of his questions about the announcement made by the Foreign Secretary last week in relation to sanctions on individuals, that is a separate matter, but we have been absolutely clear to have condemned the attack on Mr. Khashoggi the year before last, and to make sure that we have a robust regime of human rights sanctions coming from the original Magnitsky Law, which my right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, was one of the originators of, and I was involved with at the time. In terms of the number of incidents and the type of incidents, I'm not at liberty to publish that, given the confidential nature of a lot of the information that is involved in that. However, what I can say is that the UK has one of the strongest arms control regimes in the world. We use the consolidated EU and national criteria and now using the revised methodology to come to these decisions that we are happy with.
Number 4, not here, so we'll go to Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I too am disappointed that the Secretary of State is not here this afternoon to answer this urgent question herself. She based her decision on a detailed assessment of all the alleged incidents where international humanitarian law has been violated in Yemen. So let me ask the question again. Will the Minister ask his boss to publish that assessment so the people of the UK can see the evidence and will be able to judge whether she is right to simply dismiss these violations as isolated?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the incidents or the allegations have not been dismissed. But we are clear that we need to follow a sensible set of criteria, and that is why we have the consolidated criteria in place to assess export licences going forward. But I return to what I said earlier. It would not be appropriate for the government to publish its findings in relation to incidents in Yemen in the past.
Can the Minister reassure the House that the Government can still, if necessary, review, suspend and revoke licences if needed?
Thank my honourable friend for that question. She is absolutely right. Yes, they can be reviewed or revoked in line with the consolidated criteria. That is the basis on which arms control works in this country and has always done so under successive governments.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister says that the government has a very strong arms control system, but back in September last year, he will recall that the government was guilty of granting 14, was it, or 20 unlawful arms export licences. It does seem that last week's announcement, in a day after the Magnitsky sanctions were imposed, incredibly cynical. Is that not the case?
No, it isn't the case, Mr. Speaker. I think his question refers back to the Secretary of State coming to the House and apologising, and indeed apologising to the court for the inadvertent breaches of the court judgment last June. However, what we are talking about today is a forward-looking way of doing this, using the revised methodology based on the consolidated criteria.
Speaker, would my right honourable friend please explain to the House why there's been a delay in reaching this decision?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question. It was vital that the government got this right first time with a comprehensive assessment. The court judgment was a very serious matter last year, and it was absolutely right that we took the time, Mr. Speaker, to have a comprehensive assessment process that is in accordance with the legal approach identified by the Court of Appeal last June.
Richard Gibson.
Speaker, like many people listening to this today, I am astonished that the Minister has said that the global human rights sanction regime is a separate matter from selling arms to the brutal Saudi regime. But can he tell me in all good conscience how this government can continue to export weapons to Saudi Arabia when we know that there's a risk that they may be used in Yemen after 17,640 civilian casualties have been documented in that country? Is it simply a case of profit before Yemeni lives?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the process that is with me is to use the consolidated criteria, and that is why we have developed a revised methodology in respect of all the allegations which it is assessed are likely to have occurred and be caused by fixed-wing aircraft. Each of those allegations has been subject to detailed analysis by reference to the relevant principles of international humanitarian law. An evaluation has been made and therefore it's been applied to all credible incidents of concern of which we are aware. But importantly, Mr. Speaker, going forward, our revised methodology will allow us to make these decisions going forward.
We're heading up to Yorkshire to visit Imran Hamid Khan. Imran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The enduring alliance with Saudi Arabia is vitally important to regional security and bolsters the ability of the United Kingdom and her allies to help police the region. The UK has licensed over £5.3 billion worth of arms since 2015 to Saudi Arabia, which has secured thousands of jobs across the United Kingdom, including in Wakefield. Does the Minister agree with me that by maintaining arms sales to our Saudi allies, the whole of the United Kingdom prospers?
I thank my honourable friend for that question, and it is very important that we have a broad and deeper relationship covering matters like trade, defence, security, energy and regional issues. It's very important that the UK maintains that relationship overall. It doesn't prevent us, of course, from being critical, Mr. Speaker, as we have been critical on occasions in relation to human rights.
Mr. Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government of Saudi Arabia is, as is well documented, indiscriminate in their use of the death penalty, including against minors. In recent years, they have detained without trial members of their own royal family. Just recently, they were found at the World Trade Organization to be responsible for sport piracy through the Be Out Q company. What is it that makes the Minister think that that is a government that is going to have any regard for the rules of international law? And does he not agree that our new policy in relation to China would be seen in a much better light if we were seen to hold Saudi Arabia to the same standards?
Mr. Speaker, I thank him for that question. I'm not going to comment on China because I think it's not quite within the scope of the question. But at all times, the UK, in its foreign policy, campaigns actively for the abolition of the death penalty. He and I know that. He served the government not so long ago and will know that that is an important pillar of our foreign policy. However, these matters don't prevent us having an overall relationship, whereas it overall in the national interest to have a good relationship with as many countries around the world as we reasonably can. In terms of the WTO complaint, I will look into that and I will write to him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I thank my right honourable friend for his comments so far. In any arms export regime, it's important that we operate not only on a principles basis, but also respond rapidly to circumstances that change around the world, often at very short notice. So could he reassure me and the House that our regime is adaptable, is responsive and can deal with circumstances that change?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I can. We work very closely with colleagues in the Ministry of Defence. We work very closely with colleagues in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Department for International Development to make sure that we are aware of all changes in policy and all uses of military weapons around the world, and make sure that that feeds through into our ability to change policy and, if necessary, Mr. Speaker, revoke a licence.
Mr. Wills.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Saudi state media has reported that the Secretary of State for Defence called Saudi ministers last week after the announcement of sanctions against the murderers of Jamal Khashoggi and reassured them of the government's support on the issue of arms export. Can the Minister explain now why his colleague felt that this was his job and why he chose to keep that call secret?
Mr. Speaker, you will know that it's the policy of successive governments not to comment on calls or conversations between government ministers and their opposite numbers, even including if the call took place itself. So I'm not going to comment on those matters. What I will say is that there is a very, very important relationship with Saudi Arabia, multifaceted relationship, which I've already talked about, which must be considered in the round.
The Stafford.
Mr. Speaker, have my right honourable friends, the Trade Secretary and the Foreign Secretary, raised the issue of international humanitarian law compliance with Saudi Arabia and the others in the coalition?
Yes, we have. That is something, Mr. Speaker, that we do on a regular basis to make sure, as part of our wider work in the region, to make sure that the UK foreign policy goals are achieved.
Let's head up to Yorkshire and visit Rachel Maskell. Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is a difference between what is permissible and what is right. Since the bombing of Yemen commenced in March 2015, 5.3 billion worth of export licences have been issued to Saudi Arabia, of which 2.5 billion have related to bombs, missiles and other types of ordnance. So what does the Secretary of State have to hide in not publishing the evidence on which to resume licensing arms and the trade in these deadly weapons?
Mr. Speaker, I think I've already laid out to the House why these reports are not published, because a lot of them are based on confidential information, which would not be in the national interest for us to disclose. What we can say is that the incidents which have been assessed to be possible violations of international humanitarian law occurred at different times, in different circumstances, and for different reasons. And the conclusion was that these are isolated incidents. And on that basis, we believe that there is not a clear risk that the export of arms and military equipment to Saudi Arabia might be used in the commission of a serious violation of international humanitarian law.
James Sunderland. Mr. Speaker, could the Minister please outline the importance with which the UK regards Saudi Arabia as a diplomatic and trading partner in the Middle East?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for that question. And Saudi Arabia is an important diplomatic and important trading partner for this country. And that has been the case for many decades, actually under successive governments.
Let's head south of the river and visit Florence Eshalome. Florence Eshalome.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A number of my constituents in Vauxhall have written to me about their concerns about the devastating conflict in Yemen. And we must acknowledge and speak out about the immense human cost of this war. It is one of the largest humanitarian crises in the world. And we know that thousands of Yemen civilians have been killed, including women and children. And now 20 million people are facing food insecurity and 10 million at risk of famine. Mr. Speaker, this suffering is unimaginable. And we know that the coalition has conducted numerous and indiscriminate airstrikes in violation of the laws of wars, using munitions sold by the US and the United Kingdoms and others. How can a minister be confident the arms sold by the UK won't be used in similar attacks?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that is exactly why we have the arms control and export licence regime in place that we have, properly using the consolidated criteria to make those assessments. In terms of what anybody else may do in the region, I think she mentioned the United States. That is very much a matter for the United States government.
Let's head to Wellingborough and visit Peter Bone. Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And the excellent Minister seems quite sure that it's right to export these arms at the moment, and I have no problem with that. But as my honourable friends for Derbyshire Dales and Burnley have said, this needs to be kept under review, and the Minister has said that that will happen. Could he tell the House in a little bit more detail, on a day-to-day basis or a month-to-month basis, how is that review take place?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a good question. Can I just say to him, obviously we operate within an overall policy framework called the consolidated criteria. Each individual licence application is in itself a separate decision based on those consolidated criteria. We follow those criteria, and those decisions can be made on a daily basis for each individual export licence that comes in by ministers.
We're now going up to Scotland, to Stirling, with Alan Smith. Alan Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister really is missing an opportunity to reassure the House on this. I'm entirely unpersuaded that there isn't a risk these armaments will be used against civilians. Oxfam, a deeply credible organisation, has had 3 installations attacked in Sadal, Hamazat and Abs over the last few years. Have they been investigated by the Joint Incident Assessment Team? If not, why not? And if not, how on earth can the Minister possibly pretend this is a credible statement?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've said before, it is the incidents that have been assessed to be possible violations of international humanitarian laws. Those have been looked at, but we are confident that they occurred at different times, at different circumstances, and for different reasons, and therefore there is not a pattern. So we are content with this regime going forward in terms of sticking to our consolidated criteria, and that is absolutely the proper way to be doing this.
Mark O'Donoghue.
Mr. Speaker, will the Minister provide an assurance to the House that the Department will in fact continue to investigate every possible violation of international humanitarian law in the Yemen conflict by coalition forces going forward?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he raises a good question. It's worth noting again that the investigation process is principally a matter for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and the Ministry of Defence, which track the allegations of incidents. But the government takes its export responsibilities seriously and assesses all export licences in accordance with the strict licensing criteria. We will not issue any export licences where to do so would be inconsistent with the consolidated criteria.
Let's head to Walthamstow and visit Stella Creasy. Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will understand the concern, given that the United Nations Refugee Agency reports that over the last 5 years, over 3.5 million people in Yemen have been displaced as a direct result of the civil war there. So he will understand the concern about the resumption of arms sales. Now, he tells us that he cannot share with us the specific details on which the government have made the assessment to resume those sales, but he could set out for us what he means by genuine intent when he says that he believes that's behind the Saudi Arabian decisions on human rights, and what might change that. Will he do so?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've already outlined how, looking at the incidents and the assessment of the incidents, that we are confident that there is not a pattern there in those previous incidents. I absolutely share her concern about the appalling humanitarian situation in Yemen. However, based on those incidents, we do not believe that there's been a pattern there, and therefore, so long as we stick to our consolidated criteria, we continue our assessments, continue our assessment of incidents, then that is absolutely the right decision for the UK government to make.
Andrew Griffith. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud so many young people in my constituency of Arundel and South Downs have raised the situation of Yemen with me. Saudi Arabia itself is a young country with half of its population under the age of 25. Can the Minister assure me that he will continue to raise human rights with his counterparts?
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, we do. My right honourable friend, the Foreign Secretary, and his team do on a regular basis with Saudi Arabia and also with other partners all the way around the world. We are immensely proud of the record that we have as a government, that we have as a country in promoting human rights around the world. That was absolutely the basis of the statement made by the Foreign Secretary in this place just last week.
Speaker, the Secretary of State has announced that new arms sales to Saudi would commence, claiming that international humanitarian law had only been violated in, I quote, isolated incidents. The Minister as well says he's not at liberty to disclose the number of incidents. But this morning, in response to my written question, the government revealed that the Ministry of Defence's own database records 516 potential violations of international humanitarian law since the war in Yemen began in 2015. So in light of this, does the Minister stand by the Secretary of State's claim that violations of international law are only isolated incidents, or will the government finally do the right thing and stop these arms sales?
Well, Speaker, as I pointed out earlier, actually, all potential incidents for the purposes of this must be treated as actual violations of international humanitarian law. So I'm not at liberty to comment on whatever numbers she may have in front of her, but it's absolutely clear, Mr. Speaker, that all of those potential incidents must be treated as actual incidents for the purposes of putting forward the consolidated criteria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The announcement last week was welcomed by hundreds of my constituents who work at the BAE plant in the Fylde, which assembles the Hawk and Typhoon aircraft, and I'd like to go on record as supporting the decision to resume granting export licences. Saudi Arabia is one of our key strategic partners, and rightly so. Is my right honourable friend able to reassure the House that the government will continue to work closely with the Saudi government on all security and military issues, and that his department will continue to explore investment and trade opportunities with the Kingdom that will benefit jobs and economic growth in the UK?
My honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, raises a very, very good point in relation to jobs in the Northwest and BAE systems. And I must say, Mr. Speaker, I was getting a little bit worried about the opposition's approach to this, because I'm going to quote now, we have a brilliant arms industry in the United Kingdom, and I have no problem with arms sales to other countries as long as they are properly controlled. I would agree with that. That is actually the Labour shadow spokesman in the House of Lords at a similar question on Friday. I think that we can all agree that actually BAE Systems and others in this field, Mr. Speaker, do a great job for the UK overall.
Thompson.
Mr. Speaker, the United Nations has verified that since 2015, at least 7,700 Yemeni civilians have been killed, 60% of that due to bombing raids by the Saudi-led coalition. Now, the Committee on Arms Export Controls has recently been re-established in this House. Can the Minister give the House an assurance that if that committee were to choose to investigate British arms sales which are leading to arms reaching the Saudi-led coalition, that his department will cooperate fully with any such investigation?
Well, Mr. Speaker, our department always cooperates with different select committees, but I think if his point is that the select committee should follow a particular course, then I think he really needs to speak to the chair of the select committee, not with me. The chair of the select committee is my honourable friend, the member for Wyre Forest. Could I suggest that he makes his representations there to the chair?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. How will this sort of action against Saudi Arabia achieve reciprocity in the Yemen? There are two sides to this conflict, and one is led by the Houthis and by their backers, Iran, over whom we have no possible examples of how to control the arms sales that go to them.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think my honourable friend has expertise in this area. He will know that those are matters for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I'm sure he's making his representations to them. I will certainly make those representations. He will also know that the government is involved on the diplomatic front considerably to seek a resolution of the conflict in the Yemen.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, more than 5 years of death and destruction in Yemen has created the world's worst humanitarian crisis, and the Yemenis people are rightly looking to us to show compassion and leadership. Despite compelling evidence that the Saudi-led coalition has violated international humanitarian law, Mr. Speaker, a day after the government finally held Saudi Arabia accountable for the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, it announces the resumption of arms sales for use for the war in Yemen. So does the Minister concede this all makes the government's avowed concern for human rights look inconsistent, if not downright hypocritical?
No, I don't agree with that at all, Mr. Speaker. You won't be surprised to find. And I think I've already answered the question in relation to the relationship between the announcement last week, which concerns individuals in relation to human rights, and this announcement in relation to the consolidated criteria for export controls.
The Honourable Lady is absolutely right to ask her urgent question. None of us want to add to the awful situation in Yemen. Paris is working very hard with Berlin to finesse the German ban on German componentry in French arms exports. A country, of course, France, that has a more questionable approach to the consolidated criteria than this country does, and a country whose arms exports are skyrocketing. What are we to do about this, since I fear that the action being urged upon us by the Right Honourable Lady will have the effect of exporting jobs from her constituency and mine to France, a country with a far more questionable approach to the consolidated criteria, have absolutely no effect whatsoever on the welfare of people in Yemen?
Well, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend may well be right. But it is important from our perspective to make sure that the UK does adhere and does follow the consolidated criteria. That is absolutely the basis of our policy in this area. We must stick rigidly to assessments based on the consolidated criteria.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government lost the appeal court case, then admitted that they contravened the instructions given by the appeal court, then abandoned their own appeal to the Supreme Court, and now they've decided, after abandoning the court case, that they're going to resume arms exports. Now, couldn't the Minister at least agree to publish the reasons for the resumption of issuing licences, with sensitive parts either taken out or redacted?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we have published the reasons for why we are doing the policy that we're doing. We published in the form of a written ministerial statement to the House of Commons last week, and actually that's the subject today. I think in terms of his wider point about why we've withdrawn the appeal, Mr. Speaker, is that we don't think the appeal is any more necessary. We have in place the revised methodology, and we're putting in place the process to withdraw the appeal.
Mr. Speaker, last week the Foreign Secretary revealed a new and seemingly ethical dimension to the UK's foreign policy. Yet within 48 hours we were back-selling arms to Saudi Arabia, and this government was refusing to take action against its friends in Bahrain who are about to execute 2 more political prisoners. Isn't it the truth that it is business as usual for any regime, however brutal, however undemocratic, as long as their pockets are deep enough and where this government thinks there is something to be gained. Isn't that the squalid truth of this?
No, it isn't, Mr. Speaker.
Absolutely. 32-33 withdrawn, so we're going over to Captain Bob Blackman. Bob Blackman.
Mr. Speaker, the humanitarian situation in the Yemen is, of course, a proxy war between the Saudi Arabian-led coalition and the Iranians and their proxies, with the innocent civilians in the middle of it. So what efforts is my honourable friend taking to use his department's capability on trade to encourage these parties to come to the table and negotiate a political settlement, which the Yemen then can become a peaceful place for the innocent civilians to live in once again?
My honourable friend for his question, who's got great expertise in the region and in these matters. And the UK is involved right the way across. It's a whole of government effort to make sure that we seek a diplomatic solution in the region. If the Department of International Trade can play a role in that, we certainly will, and we certainly are. In terms of our relationship with Iran, it's very, very important that Iran also comply, particularly in relation to trade matters, in terms of the sanctions regime and the World Trade Organization.
This decision reduces the bold statements made last week by the government on human rights and on the Magnitsky sanctions to just mere finger wagging. And if that's not correct, then in order to restore the government's credibility on this issue, it must publish the evidence on which it based its decisions that these are just mere isolated incidents.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I mean, I could just say to him, I refer him to the answer I gave earlier, but I've already said repeatedly the reason that we're not publishing the reports on any incidents. Secondly, in terms of the international human rights violations regime launched last week by the Foreign Secretary, we do think that that new sanctions regime will give the UK a powerful new tool to hold to account those involved in serious human rights violations or abuses.
36 withdrawn. Chris Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Provides true clarity about the total value that is exported to Saudi Arabia, including arms traded through open licences? And will you provide a number for how much the UK has profited from the conflict since the war began?
Well, Mr. Speaker, could I refer, and we do publish quarterly the list of licences granted, and I would suggest that he have a look at that list.
Owen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for explaining the great care and the very strict criteria that are applied in all export licence cases? And can he update the House with regard to the backlog of export licences that exist as to how quickly and carefully those will be able to be reviewed?
Minister.
Right honourable friend for that question. There is a backlog. And I think it will take a few months to clear it. There are a few hundred applications, something of that magnitude. But with the policy that we launched last week, we will now begin to clear that backlog.
The government's policy seems to be one of abject hypocrisy. The Minister has made a false distinction between the sanctions on individuals and wider policy, but that is simply not possible to do. Let me give him one example. General Ahmed al-Assiri was listed on the Foreign Secretary's sanctions list last week for his involvement in the unlawful killing of Jamal Khashoggi and commissioning the team who went to assassinate him. That is the same man, Mr. Speaker, who came to this House on the 29th of March 2017 to justify to myself and to many other members of this House in this building the Saudi actions in Yemen, including the use of British military support. How can it be that on the one hand we are sanctioning this individual for his unlawful actions, and yet he was at the very heart of the war in Yemen?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't have information about individuals in any country in front of me as to who may or may not be subject to a sanctions regime. What I do know is that the criteria that we follow to assess export licences Criteria 2C clearly states where there is a clear risk the equipment be exported might be used in the serious violation of international humanitarian law. Those are the criteria that we follow when assessing export licences.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I firstly welcome the Secretary of State's statement last week? Would my right honourable friend elaborate on how the revised methodology differs from its predecessor?
Well, the revised methodology, Mr. Speaker, takes into account all of the decision by the Court of Appeal. Were these historic incidents part of a pattern? And even if we couldn't answer in every incident, we should at least attempt to do so. That was, if you like, the question which the revised methodology is seeking to answer, I believe does answer, so that we can move forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Saudis are currently taking part in the action in Yemen as part of a coalition. They are also part of a coalition which is currently involved in the blockade of Qatar. That's not currently a military action, but what guarantees does the government have that arms sold to the Saudis' use in Yemen will not be used against another of our allies elsewhere in the Middle East?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm not aware of there being any conflict at the moment in that space. But clearly we look at these matters as part of the criteria against which we assess export licences going forward.
Member for Beckenham, Bob Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've got a great deal of affection for Yemen, having lived there for 3 years. So after the last massacre of innocents, I managed to get myself to Riyadh, and I went to the CAOC, which is the Combined Air Operations Centre, to examine exactly what was going on. And I have to say, having spoken to the air controllers, which included Air Force, Royal Air Force people there, I was much impressed by the fire, the orders for opening fire that they had. They did not open fire, and I spoke to the pilots. Now they do not open fire unless they're guaranteed that there's no innocent underneath. Now, could I ask the Minister, therefore, that I presume these factors are taken into account?
Speaker, he makes, and he is somebody also with great expertise in this area, particularly in relation to military operations. In terms of what may or may not be happening in Yemen, of course, those factors are taken into account with the assessments done by the Ministry of Defence and by the Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
Centre Scotland with Dave Dugan. Dave Dugan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As Amnesty International pointed out in March this year, the conflict in Yemen shows no real signs of abating as it enters its 6th year. This will result in even more civilian casualties, both as a direct and indirect result of the conflict. After the UK government's arms export policy to Saudi Arabia was found to be unlawful last year, can the Minister explain how continued UK arms sales for potential use in this theatre can possibly help prevent the loss of yet more innocent Yemeni lives?
Minister. Well, Mr. Speaker, we have, of course, looked at the assessment of the previous incidents, and I've already described how those incidents must be assessed as having taken place, even if it's still questionable or in any way disputed as part of that process. But we are confident, Mr. Speaker, that we now have the right system in place to make sure that there's not a clear risk that the export of arms and military equipment to Saudi Arabia might be used in the commission of a serious violation of international humanitarian law.
Let's head to Wales with Howell Williams. Howell Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. UK taxpayers provide humanitarian aid to Yemen. Now we are to supply even more arms to the Saudis. What does this say about competition between UK trade policy and UK aid policy?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, DIT and DFID work, and the FCO work very closely together. I don't think it says anything that actually we're involved in different activities, but with the same objective of making sure that UK interests abroad are looked after, that we propagate a strong regime on international human rights protections, that we do foster trade, including with countries like Saudi Arabia in the region, and make sure that we do so with the national interest at the forefront.
In order to allow the safe exit of honourable members participating in this item of business and the safe arrival of those participating in the next, I'm suspending the House for 3 minutes. Order. Order. I now call the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster to make a statement. Duchy of Lancaster.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. With your permission, I'd like to make a statement on our preparations for the end of the transition period. But before I do, can I place on record my thanks, and I'm sure that of the whole House, for the 20 years of service that Dave Prentice, the General Secretary of Unison, has given. Mr. Prentice announced today that he'll be standing down at the end of this year. He's been an exemplary trade union leader, and we've all been reminded during the COVID pandemic how much we depend on the public sector workers whom he speaks up for, and I would like to extend my best wishes to him on his retirement. On the 31st of January this year, Mr. Speaker, the United Kingdom left the European Union. And last month we confirmed to our European Union partners there would be no extension of the transition period beyond the 31st of December. My counterpart, as co-chair of the Joint Committee, confirmed that this marked a, quote, definite conclusion to the matter, and the deadline for extension has now passed. As a consequence, from the 1st of January 2021, we will embark on the next chapter in our history as a fully independent United Kingdom. With control of our economy, we can continue to put in place the right measures for COVID recovery. With control over the money that we send to Brussels, we can spend it on our priorities, investing in the NHS, spreading opportunity more equally across the UK, and strengthening our union. And we're also able to build a trading relationship with our neighbours in Europe that serves all our interests, while also developing new economic partnerships across the world, including opportunities for new and better trade deals with the US, Japan, New Zealand, Australia, and many other nations. The deal the Prime Minister struck last year, which the country backed in the general election, means that we can look forward with confidence to the end of the transition period on December the 31st. But of course there is still work to do to prepare. Regardless of the outcome of negotiations with the EU over our future relationship, whether or not we have a Canada-style deal or an Australian model, we will be leaving the single market and the customs union. This will herald changes and significant opportunities for which we all need to prepare. Government, business and individual citizens. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm announcing today two significant new initiatives that will bring financial support, further clarity and also reassurance for business and citizens. We're launching a major new public information campaign to make sure that everyone has the facts they need about the actions that we all need to take in order to be ready. And we're also releasing for the first time an operating model for the border that will benefit importers and exporters and provide information to hauliers, shippers, freight companies and our customs intermediaries. This comprehensive guidance covers every process and system used across all government departments and has been developed after extensive consultation with industry partners, operators and of course the devolved administrations. Together with the additional £705 million package of funding for border infrastructure, extra jobs and better technology, this will help ensure our new borders will be ready when the UK takes back control on January the 1st. It will assist the smooth movement of goods and it will also help us to lay the foundations for the world's most effective border by 2025, making our country more secure and our citizens safer. Turning to the detail of these initiatives, Mr. Speaker, the public information campaign, the UK's New Start, Let's Get Going, will run in the 4 home nations and internationally, encouraging us all to play our part in preparing for change. The campaign will be supplemented by the deployment of experts in the field, giving one-to-one support to business and their supply chains to ensure they've made arrangements that will help keep their operations running efficiently. From January 2021, in order to fulfil the import process, traders will need to have a GB Economic Operator Registration and Identification, or EORI number, before moving their goods. They'll need also to have the commodity code of their goods, which will be needed to make a customs declaration and, of course, to calculate duties on an import. They'll need to know the customs values of their goods, the rules of which are based on the WTO valuation agreement. And they will also need to have considered whether they are able to and would benefit from using any of the available simplifications or facilitations, including deferring customs declarations for standard goods. Traders who choose not to defer the customs declarations will also need to ensure they've considered how they will make those declarations to HMRC systems, and of course, whether or not they will use an intermediary. And from January 2021, traders who are exporting goods to the EU will need to make export declarations and ensure they have the right certificates and licences required for entry. While there is still work to do, substantial progress has been made to ensure that we all fulfil our promise to the British people and take back control. The freedom to control our own borders, of course, brings many benefits. Our plans mean that we can introduce a migration policy which ensures that we're open to the world's best talent. and my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, has set out further details of this today. A new, points-based immigration system will ensure that we can attract the scientists, innovators and entrepreneurs who can power future economic growth. It will also help us to ensure that our NHS attracts the very best professionals from across the world to our hospitals. And the new technology that we're introducing will allow us to monitor with far greater precision exactly who and what is coming in and out of our country, enabling us to deal more effectively with organised crime and other threats. And control of our borders also means that we can choose the right trade and commercial policies for this country. The border operating model that we published today provides clarity about the end-to-end journey of goods on the move between Great Britain and the EU, including, of course, information about controlled goods and the new government systems that will support future trade. And I'd like to place on record the government's gratitude to the border sector for the practical knowledge, enthusiasm and expertise they've brought to the development of the operating model, the result of extensive consultation and collaboration. It's important to note that, as the document makes clear, the border operating model does not cover matters relating specifically to the Northern Ireland Protocol. Let me reassure the House that guidance specific to Northern Ireland will be published in the coming weeks and on an ongoing basis throughout the transition period. With autonomy, of course, comes the freedom to be practical and pragmatic in implementation, which is why, in the light of coronavirus and in order to give business and industry more time to adjust, we announced last month that border controls will be introduced in 3 stages up to the 1st of July 2021. In the first phase, from January 2021, traders importing standard goods will need to prepare for basic customs requirements. Full customs declarations will be needed for controlled and excise goods, such as alcohol and tobacco products, but people importing standard goods will have up to 6 months to make their declaration and to pay tariffs. Traders moving goods using the Common Transit Convention will need to follow all of the transit procedures. In the second phase, from April 2021, we'll require all products of animal origin, regulated plants and plant products to have pre-notification and the relevant health documentation. Any physical checks will continue to be conducted at the point of destination. And in the third and final phase, from July 2021, traders moving all goods will have to make full customs declarations at the point of importation and, of course, pay relevant tariffs. Checks for animals, plants and their products will take place at border control posts in Great Britain. When we announced our approach to controls last month, we also confirmed that we would be building new border facilities in Great Britain for carrying out the required checks, as well as providing targeted support to ports to build new infrastructure. And the £705 million funding injection we announced yesterday, Mr. Speaker, is on top of an £84 million grant already announced to ensure sufficient capacity in the customs intermediary sector. And that money will be used to do just that, preparing our border infrastructure for all these changes by improving and developing IT systems, recruiting more personnel and building new border posts. The actions, Mr. Speaker, that we're taking today are an important step towards readiness for the new opportunities that Brexit can bring. It is time for our new start, time for us to embrace a new global destiny, and therefore, Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
We now come to the Shadow Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for advance sight of his statement this afternoon. I'd also like to associate myself with his comments about Dave Prentice, a great trade union leader, always fighting for a better deal for public sector workers. It is vital that businesses and jobs are supported and that the oven-ready deal that the country was promised is delivered upon this year. And yet, frankly, Mr. Speaker, many of us are worried about whether the oven was even turned on. Mr. Speaker, there have been alarm bells ringing within the Cabinet this last week, expressed by the Trade Secretary in her extraordinary letter to the Right Honourable Gentleman and to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, written on the 8th of July. The letter presents a picture of chaos, complacency and confusion right at the top of government. Let me highlight to the House those concerns. First, the Trade Secretary expresses concern that the UK will be vulnerable to a World Trade Organisation challenge. So, will the government publish its advice and analysis on the risk and cost to the government of such a challenge? Second, the Trade Secretary highlights that there are EU-facing ports where the infrastructure to implement controls does not currently exist. Can the Minister give the country, and indeed his Cabinet colleague, reassurance by publishing all relevant delivery plans, land purchases and rental agreements with timescales and risks, and not just for the Port of Dover? Mr Speaker, the Labour Party want to see British firms exporting. We do not want to see their goods stuck at ports or indeed in lorry parks. Third, the Trade Secretary is concerned in her letter that traders from the rest of the world could export their goods to the UK through the EU and, in her words, undermine the effective operation of our trade policy and undermine the collection of tariffs due. How will the government prevent smugglers from exploiting the phased-in approach to the border? What are the estimated lost tariffs as a result of the 6-month delay to UK border checks on imports travelling through the European Union? Fourth, on Northern Ireland, the Trade Secretary said that the digital delivery of the dual tariff system in Northern Ireland is a high risk and that HMRC are planning to apply the EU tariff as a default from the 1st of January. The Trade Secretary adds that this is very concerning as this may call into question the Northern Ireland's place in the UK's customs territory. Her words, Mr Speaker. So what risk does the government attach to this? What reassurance can the Minister provide that the commitments made in the government's command paper on Northern Ireland will be fully honoured? And why do we have to wait until the end of this month for details on Northern Ireland to be published? It's all very well, Mr Speaker, announcing a multi-million-pound advertising campaign, but if the right honourable gentleman can't persuade his bestest friend in Cabinet that everything is going according to plan, then it's hardly surprising that the country is anxious and confused. A month ago, the Prime Minister said that there was no reason a deal could not be reached by the end of this month. Can the Minister update us where we are in terms of being on track to meet that deadline with a deal agreed in the next fortnight? The government has previously estimated that there will be up to 400 million customs declarations per year. HMRC said that they would cost £32 each, adding up to a staggering £12.8 billion bill for business. Does the Minister have any updated assessment of those numbers and the cost to UK firms? It is also reported that HMRC are not planning to test the systems until November, a handful of weeks before they are needed. Could the Minister explain why those checks are not taking place sooner? And would the Minister outline what recent engagement the government has had with Scottish and Welsh governments on state aid policy prior to the announcements today? Over half of UK trade will experience greater delays, costs and barriers. So what percentage of UK trade, can I ask the Minister, will enjoy easier trading terms on the 1st of January next year? Mr Speaker, the best way to help all businesses to prepare is, of course, to agree a deal with the European Union on the terms we were told to expect. That means no fees, charges, tariffs or quantitative restrictions across all sectors. It does not mean, as we had in the statement today, customs, physical checks, export declarations, a commodity code, an economic operator restrictions and identification. And it certainly doesn't mean a living document with guidance that changes day by day. Mr Speaker, I'm sure the Minister will agree with me that we should never make promises that we cannot keep. So will the Minister guarantee that the promises made to UK businesses and workers in the Conservative Party manifesto in December last year will be honoured, because they are not consistent with the statement that he has delivered this afternoon? Last week, the Chancellor of the Exchequer stood at that dispatch box and said that he would do all he can to support British business. Today, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster stands at that same dispatch box and is wrapping those businesses in red tape and sending them to a supersized lorry park in Dover. For the sake of all workers worried about their jobs and all business owners anxious about their future, we need the government to get this right. I am not convinced that today's statement does that.
Chancellor of the Duchy.
Can I thank the Honourable Lady for her questions and also for her commitment to working collaboratively in order to ensure that we get the best possible deal in our negotiations with the European Union. And it is the case that progress has been made. Still, there are significant differences between ourselves and the European Union. But I did think it was significant and welcome that, for example, in the Joint Committee, Maroš Šefčovič, the Vice President, conceded that it wouldn't be no longer appropriate for the EU to have an office in Northern Ireland, an example of the flexibility which I know Michel Barnier and others are applying in the broader negotiations, and I will seek to update the House on progress in those negotiations at an appropriate time. She asks about the compliance of our approach with our legal obligations under the WTO. We're absolutely certain, we've taken legal advice, that we are compliant. And indeed, Lars Carlson, a customs expert who appeared in front of the Select Committee on the future relationship with the European Union recently, said that the issue raised was not a problem. There is no violation of international customs principles. The international legislation that the UK is part of under the WTO is not violated. And of course, it will be removed, the correct process that we're taking, on the 1st of July. She asked about infrastructure at EU-facing ports. I should stress that there are no plans to build a new lorry park at Dover, and indeed the Chief Executive of the Port of Dover, Tim Reardon, said that it, again, to the Right Honourable Gentleman's Select Committee, it's fair to say that traders are likely to be ready. The paperwork required to go into and out of France, those requirements have been set out very clearly for some time now. The Honourable Lady also asked about the danger of lost tariffs. There's no danger of lost tariffs. Every importer will have to pay tariffs. We're simply making sure that that process is staged. And it is also important to stress, as a number of those involved in the haulage industry and in the freight industry have emphasised, that this phased approach is a sensible and pragmatic way of ensuring that we can be in a stronger position. She asked about the situation in Northern Ireland. Is it the case that the EU tariff is the default? No, it is not. And she also asks about state aid. State aid, subsidy control, support for businesses is important, but it is also a reserved matter. Finally, I'd just like to quote from, again, the Chief Executive of the Port of Dover, because the Honourable Lady understandably is anxious to ensure that business has all the opportunities that we would want to see in the COVID recovery. The Chief Executive of the Port of Dover said, being outside the EU customs code puts the UK in a position where it can develop processes that suit the UK in the 21st century. We do not need to stick to a legacy customs process whose origin can be found in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in the year 789. It's time that we modernised our border, time that we took back control, and that is what today's announcement will do.
Sir Bernard. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank my right honourable friend for his statement, and that I've just stepped out of a meeting with the British Chamber of Commerce, and they're very much welcoming the acceleration in implementation, investment and certainty for British business, though they want as much of that as quickly as possible. Can I just ask for clarification on two rather technical matters, and I'm going to choose my words rather carefully. First, that as long as the joint committee is satisfied that movement of goods in transit from GB to Northern Ireland are not at risk of travelling onto the Republic of Ireland, while there may need to be some data transfer, there will be no need for a full import customs declaration to cross from GB to Northern Ireland. And secondly, now that the implementation of the final UK-EU border is going to be effectively phased to July 2021, and this could violate WTO rules, that there will be legal certainty that there will be no extension beyond July 2021, and that Parliament can provide that legal certainty in UK primary legislation if it's required.
Chancellor of the Duchy.
I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Chair of the Liaison Committee, for his thoughtful and detailed questions. On the first, which relates, of course, to the Northern Ireland Protocol, it is the case that there will need to be the provision of certain information in order to ensure that the UK plays its part in the implementation of the protocol in helping to protect the EU's single market, and we will be saying more about that later this month. On the point about the phased implementation of controls, we're entirely satisfied that that's compliant with WTO procedures, but he's right to stress that that's because it is a temporary regime, and we will ensure that there is no alteration to the timetable that we've set out.
SNP spokesperson Pete Wishart.
Well, here we are, Mr. Speaker, the end game of the disastrous and tortuous Brexit, all summed up neatly in a not too catchy slogan of "Let's get going." Dominic Cummings must have been up all night thinking of that one. We are now to have an economic downturn precipitated by COVID, compounded by their hard Brexit. It doesn't matter the chaos the Brexit will bring, it doesn't matter the damage it will inflict on the economy, the decimation of key sectors, the chaos at borders, the threat to livelihoods. All of this supremely inconsequential for all of these anti-EU obsessive. Let's get going, says the Chancellor of the Duchy, and we in Scotland intend to take him exactly at his word. Maybe not quite in the way that he intended, because we fully intend to get going from their disastrous Brexit Britain.
Yep.
54% of the Scottish people now support Scottish independence.
Yep.
54%. That support is only going to go up. And for the Tories, all they can now try to do is to impose their will on a recalcitrant Scotland. Their latest squeeze, of course, is to curb devolution, to attack the powers of the Scottish Parliament, to impose a UK single market on a Scotland wanting out of their UK. This, my Brexiteer friends, is the new UK superstate. Remember that word, superstate, and all of its nightmarish controlling horror as used so chillingly but wrongly assigned to the European Union. The superstate is arriving for Scotland, but it's not wearing gold stars on blue, it is wearing a Union Jack. And all this will do is to turn that trickle of Remainers that are now supporting independence to a full-going flood. All I can say to the right honourable gentleman is we won't be participating in this new UK single market, making it work or implementing it. The only thing we'll be doing with it is using it as a recruiting sergeant for more people to independence. I suppose he's now got two choices when it comes to Scottish independence. He could do it easily and conveniently in partnership with us, or he could draw it out in a useless, self-defeating process of attrition. Either way, we win. Enjoy your Brexit, my Conservative friends. We will be coming with you. You may be getting going from the EU, but is it right that we are getting going from the UK?
Well, it's always a pleasure to see the honourable gentleman. And it's particularly good to see him in his place here in the chamber. I have to say that is a particularly brave move, given the comments of the First Minister of Scotland over the course of the weekend, because it may well be the case, if as rumoured, that quarantine regulations mean that people can't move from England to Scotland, that he'll be imprisoned in this place for far longer than he ever anticipated. But I for one, will be cheering because I so enjoy his company. The honourable gentleman, as is his wont and as is his right, chose to skate lightly over the detail in his response, but nevertheless he made a number of important points. He suggested that as a result of our departure from the European Union, we would be curbing devolution. That's not the case. It is the case that there are more than 100 powers that return to the Scottish Parliament as a result of our leaving the European Union. Far from being a power grab, it is a power surge for all of the parliaments of the United Kingdom. He also made the point that, which we know that it's the Scottish National Party's policy to leave the UK, but then to join the European Union, which would mean that all of those powers that flow to the Scottish Parliament would be returned to Brussels, including, of course, the return of Scotland's capacity to regulate its own fishing waters to the EU as Scotland was shackled to the common fisheries policy. So the SNP's position, curiously, is to demand fewer powers for the Scottish Parliament and more powers for the European Commission. Not, I think, a popular view in Fraserburgh. And then the final thing that I would say is that the honourable gentleman, of course, talked about our proposals, which are designed to ensure that Scotland's businesses and Scotland's citizens can continue to sell their goods and their services into the rest of the UK. He, instead of welcoming that collaborative working, talked about these policies being a recruiting sergeant for independence. I would say that the mask slipped, but indeed he's never worn a mask to hide his intentions. He's a separatist, he's a nationalist. I love him dearly, but as long as he cleaves to that ideology, then I'm afraid we have to recognise that he's in the wrong boat.
Alexander Stafford.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The people of Rother Valley voted overwhelmingly for Brexit 4 years ago, yet still we are here. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the public wants to hear more of the opportunities that come leaving the European Union, and rather than the scaremongering and doing down a country that we keep hearing from the ventures opposite?
Chancellor Tedeschi.
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point. It was the democratic decision of the whole United Kingdom to leave the European Union. There are significant opportunities, and one of the points that I alluded to in my statement is that as businesses prepare for the export requirements that will be needed when we're outside the customs union, it is also the case that that equips them all the more powerfully for the new trading opportunities that exist across the globe.
Hilary Bennett.
Thank you very much. Indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. The right honourable gentleman says he's not intending to create a massive concrete lorry park in Ashford. I'd just gently point out that if the lorries arriving there don't park up and stop, it'll be very hard for people to check their paperwork, so the lorries will be parking. But can he clarify something about this site? Will it just be for lorries leaving the UK to check that they have the right paperwork so they don't clog up the system at Dover and in Calais? Or will it be for checks on goods coming into the UK in lorries, or both? And will it be operational along with the goods vehicle movement service IT system by the end of this year?
Chancellor.
Well, I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Gentleman because it gives me a chance to clarify a number of points. The Honourable Lady suggested that we would be building a lorry park at Dover. As the Honourable Gentleman points out, we're specifically moving infrastructure away from the port. And as the Chief Executive of the Port of Dover, Tim Reardon, pointed out, indeed to his own committee, one of the most helpful things that came out of the government's announcement was the commitment to construct new control infrastructure away from the port, away from the key pinch point. And combined with the GVMS system to which he alludes, this will ensure that we have the free flow of freight, none of the anticipated problems that have been mentioned, and as a result, this investment in infrastructure will ensure that we can have lorries moving out of the UK to the EU with our high-quality goods.
Andrew Mitchell.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm very glad that my right honourable friend is responsible for this with his acknowledged administrative flair. And I want to raise with him an esoteric point which has been raised by constituents consistently, and it is this. What is going to replace the regime which has so successfully allowed our constituents to travel in their thousands with their dogs across the Channel? Will he try to ensure that the existing pet passport arrangement for dogs and other pets is able to continue after the end of this year?
Chancellor of the Duchy.
Well, my right honourable friend makes an important point. I should say that my right honourable friend, like me and like many of his constituents, is a proud dog owner. Scarlett Mitchell is, I think, a previous winner of the Westminster Dog of the Year competition. But seriously, it is the case that people cherish the opportunity to travel with their pets. If we are not a listed country, then there will be additional procedures that individual pet owners will have to follow beyond those which currently exist. But we're confident that we will be a listed country because we have none of the health risks here in the UK that those countries which are not listed by the EU have. So I'm confident that, that he and Scarlett, who's a beautiful Mitchell, which I believe is the full name of his pet, will be able to continue to visit France.
We now go to Barry Shearman.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can I inform the Secretary of State that as a member of the Select Committee on Leaving Europe and the future relationship with Europe, I find it rather negative of him to take out of context some of the quotes from the witnesses that have given evidence to the committee. I've heard all the evidence since I've been a member, and I have to tell him that my view is we're heading for a disaster. And what does he say to a leading businessman in my constituency? He said, we're staggering because of coronavirus, coming out of the ring, having gone 15 rounds with Anthony Joshua, only to find, as we leave this chaos of leaving Europe, we've got Tyson Fury for another 15. Is it fair to do this to our great British public?
Chancellor of the Duchy.
Seconds out round one, I'm tempted to reply. But the honourable gentleman, the right honourable gentleman, knows that I have great affection and respect for him. And indeed, it was his questioning at the Select Committee that helped elucidate some of the opportunities that leaving the European Union can bring. The customs expert Lars Carlson, whom I mentioned earlier, who spoke before the committee, talked about leaving the European Union being a great opportunity, because part of the UK strategy and global vision for trade opens up totally new industries here which can be more efficient and bring additional benefits to British business. So I think it's important, of course, to be aware of the challenges, but also the opportunities.
Julian Smith.
And Deputy Speaker, with so many of our small and UK-wide businesses struggling to survive following the COVID crisis, the idea of adding additional friction and costs to the trading relationship with their biggest market is really and deeply problematic and worrying.
My right honourable friend has worked extremely hard for the country over the past few months, but can I urge him and request of him to do everything he can to ensure that the UK gets a deal with minimal tariffs and minimal friction?
Can I again thank my right honourable friend for the role that he played in reconstituting the Northern Ireland Executive earlier this year, which has made the whole process, of course, of agreeing the approach towards the Northern Ireland Protocol and safeguarding the rights of Northern Ireland citizens significantly easier. And I think we should all be grateful for his leadership in that role, which helped advance the cause of peace. I should say that on the specific point about securing a comprehensive free trade agreement with the European Union, I'm completely with him. I think that it would be better for us to have, as the Honourable Lady also mentioned, the zero tariff, zero quota approach that we can secure through a comprehensive FTA. But I should add that whether or not we secure that FTA, many of the steps that I've outlined today will be required by business as no regret steps anyway.
We now go to James Murray.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. At the end of March, I was told by the Health Minister, the Honourable Member for Mid-Bedfordshire, that any European Union centrally authorised COVID-19 vaccine would be authorised in the UK during the transition period, and that the government was working to ensure that UK patients can access the best and most innovative medicines beyond the 31st of December 2020. Can the Minister now guarantee that whatever else changes at the end of this year, there will be no risk of any delay after 31st of December in the UK acquiring a COVID-19 vaccine in comparison to countries in the EU?
Chancellor of the Duchy.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for his question. It is the case that there is global collaboration through the CEPI programme in order to try to ensure that all countries who are determined to deal with the COVID-19 threat can work together in order to develop a vaccine. And we have relationships with European and other nations which are there to ensure that we're in a strong position to be able to provide a vaccine for our citizens once one is effectively tested.
Rob Butler.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Buckinghamshire has more micro businesses than any other county in the country. What steps is my right honourable friend taking to ensure that these very smallest firms are fully aware of the steps that they will need to take so that they really can get going with the new opportunities they will enjoy after the transition period?
Chancellor of the Duchy.
Well, my honourable friend makes an important point. In Buckinghamshire and elsewhere where there are micro businesses, they can take advantage of the new information campaign that we provided. There is an online checker which will allow them to judge whether or not they have taken the steps appropriate in order to be ready to trade. They can also register for regular updates in order to ensure that they are making progress in a timely fashion. And of course the provision of additional funding for customs intermediaries will also ensure that they can have an appropriate freight forwarder or other in order to ensure that they can continue to trade freely.
We now go to Alison Thewlis.
Thank you very much. It's perfectly clear from his statement that what's actually happening here is we're going to get more red tape rather than less, and additional cost and risk to employers, especially those who employ EU nationals, as they will have to register as EU sponsors, as Home Office sponsors for the first time. Can